in all the fetes offered by the first consul to their majesties, the king and queen of Etruria, Mademoiselle Hortense had shone with that splendor of youth and grace which made her the pride of her mother and the most beautiful ornament of the budding court of the first consul. About this time she inspired the most violent passion in a gentleman of very good family, but whose brain was already, I think, somewhat deranged before he took this foolish love into his head. This unfortunate incessantly prowled about Malmaison, and as soon as Mademoiselle came out, he would run to the side of the carriage, and with the liveliest demonstrations of affection throw flowers, locks of his hair, and verses of his composition in through the door. Whenever he met Mademoiselle on foot, he would throw himself on his knees before her with 1,000 passionate gestures, and call her by the most touching names. In spite of everybody, he followed her even to the court of the chateau, and gave himself up to all his folly. At first, Mademoiselle, being young and gay, amused herself with the affections of her adorer. She read the verses he sent her, and gave them to the ladies who accompanied to read also. Such poetry was calculated to produce laughter. Hence she found no fault with it at first, but after these first transports of gaiety, Mademoiselle Hortense, who, like her mother, was good and charming, never failed to say, with a compassionate look and accent, "That poor man is very much to be pitied." In the end, however, the importunities of this wretched madman multiplied so that they became insupportable. In Paris, he would stand at the door of the theaters whenever Mademoiselle Hortense was to go there, and prostrate himself at her feet, supplicating, weeping, laughing, and gesticulating all at once. This spectacle amused the crowd too much to continue to amuse Mademoiselle de Beauharnais any longer. Carat was ordered to get rid of the unfortunate man, who was, I think, placed in an asylum. Mademoiselle would have been only too happy if she had known love, except through the burlesque effects it produced in a deranged brain. In that case, she would have seen it only on its comic and amusing side, but the moment came when she had to feel all the sorrow and bitterness there is in the disappointments of this passion. In January 1802, she was married to Monsieur Louis Bonaparte, brother of the first consul. This alliance was suitable as far as age was concerned. Monsieur Louis was hardly 24, and Mademoiselle de Beauharnais not more than 18. And yet it was the source of long and interminable vexations to both of them. Monsieur Louis was, however, good and sensible, full of benevolence and wit, studious, and a friend of letters, like all his brothers except one, but his health was poor. He was ill almost constantly, and had a melancholy disposition. All of the first consul's brothers resembled him more or less, and Monsieur Louis more than the others, especially in the days of the consulate and before the Emperor Napoleon grew fat. At the same time, not one of his brothers had that incisive and imposing glance and that rapid and imperious gesture, which came to him at first by instinct and afterwards through the habit of command. Monsieur Louis had peaceful and modest tastes. It had been claimed that at the time of his marriage he had a keen attachment for a person whose name could not be discovered, and is, I believe, a mystery still. Mademoiselle Hortense was extremely pretty, with a charming and mobile countenance. However, she was full of grace, talents, and affability, benevolent and lovable like her mother. She had not that excessive facility, or better, that feebleness of character, which sometimes detracted from Madame Bonaparte. Yet this is the woman whom the evil rumors spread abroad by wretched libelers have so outrageously calumniated. One's gorge rises with disgust and indignation when such revolting absurdities are told and repeated. It is If these worthy fabricators are to be believed, the first consul must have seduced his wife's daughter before giving her in marriage to his own brother. one only has to put such a thing into words to make its falsity comprehended. I know the love affairs of the emperor better than anybody. In that sort of clandestine connections, he dreaded scandal and hated the boastings of vice, and I can affirm on my honor that the infamous desires which have been attributed to him never germinated in his heart, like all those, and even better than all those who approached Mademoiselle de Beauharnais, because he knew his stepdaughter more intimately. He had the tenderest affection for her, but this sentiment was entirely paternal, and Mademoiselle responded to it with that respectful fear which a well-bred girl experiences in the presence of her father. She could have obtained all she desired from her stepfather if extreme timidity had not prevented her from asking, but instead of addressing herself directly to him, she would in the first place have recourse to the secretary who attended the emperor. Would she have acted in this way if the evil rumors scattered by her enemies and those of the emperor had had the least foundation? Before this marriage, Mademoiselle had an inclination for General Duroc. He was barely 30, well-made, and a favorite of the head of state, who, knowing him to be prudent and reserved, had entrusted several important missions to him. An aide-de-camp of the first consul, a general of division, and governor of the Tuileries, he had long been living in intimate familiarity with Malmaison and the home of the first consul. During his obligatory absences, he kept up a regular correspondence with Mademoiselle Hortense, and yet the indifference with which he allowed her marriage with Monsieur Louis proves that he shared but feebly in the affection which he had inspired. It is certain that he might have had Mademoiselle de Beauharnais for his wife if he had been willing to accept the terms on which the first consul offered him his stepdaughter's hand, but he expected something better, and his usual prudence failed at the moment when it might have shown him a future easy to foresee and calculated to crown the wishes of an ambition more exalted than his own. Hence he flatly refused, and the entreaties of Madame Bonaparte, which had already shaken her husband, took decidedly the upper hand. Madame Bonaparte, who found herself not treated in a very friendly manner by the brothers of the first consul, sought to create a support for herself in this family against the troubles constantly accumulated around her by those who sought to deprive her of her husband's affection. It was with this end in view that she did all she could to bring about a marriage between her daughter and one of her brothers-in-law. General Duroc probably repented in the end of the precipitancy of his refusal when crowns began to reign into the august family with which he might have allied himself. When he saw Naples, Spain, Westphalia, Upper Italy, the duchies of Parma, Lucca, etc., becoming the appanages of the new imperial dynasty, when the beautiful and gracious Hortense herself, who had loved him very much, ascended the throne which she would have been so happy to share with the object of her first affections. As for him, he married Mademoiselle Hervas d'Almenara, daughter of the banker of the court of Spain, a little woman, very brown, very thin, and not very graceful, but on the other hand, of the most vixenish, haughtiest, most exacting, and capricious temper. As she was to have an enormous dowry in marriage, the first consul asked her hand for the first aide-de-camp. I have been told that Madame Duroc forgot herself so far as to beat her servants, and even to fly into the strangest passions with people in no wise dependent on her. When Monsieur Dubois came to tune her piano, if she was unfortunately present, as she could not endure the noise required by this operation, she would drive the tuner away with the utmost violence. In one of these singular fits, she one day broke all the keys of her instrument. At another time, Monsieur Meunier, clockmaker to the Emperor and the first artist in Paris of his profession, with Monsieur Breguet, having brought her a very costly watch, which had been ordered by the Duchess de Friol herself. That's the title, Duroc's wife. This bijou did not please her, and in her rage she threw the watch on the floor again, began to dance on it, and broke it into pieces in Monsieur Meunier's presence. She would never pay for it, and the marshal was obliged to settle the bill himself. Thus the mistaken refusal of General Duroc and the not very disinterested calculations of Madame Bonaparte caused the misery of 2 households. For the rest, the portrait I've just drawn, and which I think true, although not much flattered, is simply that of a young woman spoiled like an only daughter, harsh-tempered like a Spaniard, and brought up with that indulgence and even with that absolute negligence which injures the education of all the compatriots of Mademoiselle de Memoirs. Time is calm, this vivacity of youth, and Madame the Duchess de Friol has since given an example of the most tender devotion to all her duties and of a great strength of soul in the frightful misfortunes she has had to endure for the loss of her husband. Most sorrowful though it was, glory had at least some consolations to offer to the widow of the Grand Marshal. But when a young girl, sole heiress to a great name and an illustrious title, is suddenly carried away by death from all the hopes and all the love of her mother, who would dare to speak of her of consolations? If there could be any, which I do not believe, it must needs be the remembrance of the cares and tenderness lavished to the end by a maternal heart. This memory, the bitterness of which is mingled with a certain sweetness, cannot be lacking to Madame the Duchess of Friol. The religious ceremony of the marriage took place January 7th in the house on the Rue de la Victoire, and the marriage of General Murat with Mademoiselle Caroline Bonaparte, which had only been contracted before the officer of the civil law, was consecrated the same day. The 2 spouses, Monsieur Louis and his wife, were very melancholy. The latter wept bitterly during the ceremony, and her tears were not stanched afterwards. She was far from seeking her husband's eyes, and on his side he was too proud and too embittered to pursue her with his attentions. The good Josephine did all she could to unite them, feeling that this union, which commenced so badly, was her work. She would have liked to reconcile her own interest, or at least what she considered such, with the happiness of her daughter, but her efforts, like her advice and entreaties, accomplished nothing. I have 100 times seen Madame Louis Bonaparte seek the solitude of her own apartment and the bosom of a friend to shed her tears there. They escaped from her even in the salon of the First Consul, where one sorrowfully beheld this brilliant and gay young woman who had often done the honors and relaxed the stiffness of etiquette so graciously, now retiring into a corner or into the embrasure of a window with some person in whom she trusted to confide her troubles to her. During this interview, from which she emerged with red and human eyes, her husband kept himself pensive and taciturn at the opposite end of the salon. People have greatly censured the errors of Her Majesty the Queen of Holland, and all that has been said or written against this princess bears the marks of gross exaggeration. So lofty a fortune drew all eyes upon her and excited a jealous malevolence, and yet those who have envied her would not have failed to pity themselves if they had been put in her place on condition of sharing her afflictions. The misfortunes of Queen Hortense began with her life. Her father dead on the revolutionary scaffold, her mother thrown into prison. She found herself, when yet a child, isolated and without other support than the fidelity of the former servants of the family. Her brother, the noble and worthy Prince Eugene, had been obliged, they say, to apprentice himself to the trade. She had some years of happiness, or at least of repose, during the time that which she was confided to the motherly cares of Madame Campan, and also after leaving her boarding school. But fate was now released from obligations. Her inclinations thwarted, an unhappy marriage opened for her a new train of misfortunes. The death of her first son, whom the emperor had intended to adopt and whom he had designated as his successor to the empire, the divorce of her mother, the cruel death of her dearest friend, Madame de Broc, who fell down a precipice before her eyes, the overthrow of the imperial throne, which caused her to lose her title and her rank as queen, a loss which she felt much less sensibly than she did the misfortune of him whom she regarded as her father. Finally, the continual annoyances of her domestic disputes, the vexatious trial, and her sorrow at beholding her eldest son taken from her by her husband's order. Such have been the principal catastrophes of a life which one might have thought destined to much happiness. On the day after the marriage of Mademoiselle Hortense, the First Consul started for Lyons where the deputies of the Cisalpine Republic assembled for the election of a president who were awaiting him. Everywhere along his passage he was received amidst fetes and by the felicitations which people were eager to express to him on the miraculous manner in which he had escaped from the plots of his enemies. This journey did not differ in any way from those he made afterwards as emperor. On arriving in Lyon, he received a visit of all the authorities of the constituted bodies, deputations from the neighboring departments, and members of the Italian Council. Madame Bonaparte, who went on this journey, accompanied her husband to the theater and shared with him the honors of the magnificent fete ordered him by the city of Lyon, the day when the council elected and proclaimed the first consul president of the Italian Republic. He reviewed the troops of the garrison on the Place de Breteau and recognized several soldiers of the army of Egypt with whom he talked for some time. On all these occasions, the first consul wore the same costume, which he did at Malmaison, and which I have described elsewhere. He rose early, mounted his horse, and visited the public works, among others those of Place Bellecour, the first stone of which he had laid on his return from Italy. He went through the Breteau, inspecting and examining everything, and always indefatigable, working on coming in again as if he had been at the Tuileries. He seldom changed his dress, that only happening when he received the authorities at his table or the principal inhabitants. He received all requests kindly. Before leaving, he presented the mayor of the city with a scarf of honor and the Pope's legate with a rich snuff box ornamented with his portrait. The deputies of the council also received presents and were not backward in returning them. They offered Madame Bonaparte some magnificent ornaments and diamonds and precious stones and the most costly jewels. The first consul, on arriving in Lyon, had been keenly afflicted by the sudden death of a worthy prelate whom he had known in his first Italian campaign. The Archbishop of Milan had come to Lyon in spite of his great age to see the first consul, whom he loved tenderly, so much so that in conversation the venerable old man had been heard to address the young general as my son. The peasants of Pavia, having revolted because they had been fanaticized by being told that the French wished to destroy their religion, the Archbishop of Milan, to prove to them that their fears were groundless, had often shown himself in the carriage with General Bonaparte. This prelate had stood the journey perfectly. Monsieur de Talleyrand, who had arrived in Lyon some days before the first consul, had given a dinner to the Cisalpine deputies and the principal notabilities of the city. The Archbishop of Milan was on his right, hardly seated, and as he was bending towards Monsieur de Talleyrand to speak to him, he died in his chair. January 12th, the city of Lyon offered to the first consul and Madame Bonaparte a magnificent ball, preceded by a concert at 8 o'clock in the evening. The three mayors, accompanied by the commissioners of the fete, came to seek their guests at the government palace. I seem still to see that immense amphitheater, magnificently decorated and illuminated by chandeliers and candles without number. Those seats draped with the richest tapestries from the manufactories of the city and covered with thousands of brilliant women, some of them young and beautiful, and all of them ornamental. The theater had been selected as the place for the entertainment. At the entry of the first consul and of Madame Bonaparte, who came forward giving an arm to one of the mayors, there rose a thunder of applause and acclamations. All at once the theatrical decorations disappeared and gave way to the Place Bonaparte, the former Place Bellecour, such as it had been restored by the order of the first consul. In the middle of it arose a pyramid surmounted by the statue of the first consul, who was represented as leaning on a lion. Trophies of arms and of bas-reliefs figured on one of the faces the battle of Arcola, and on the other that of Marengo. When the first transports, excited by this spectacle, which simultaneously recalled the good deeds and the victories of the hero of the fete, had quieted down, the great silence fell, and then delightful music, blended with chants, all celebrating the glory of the first consul, his wife, the warriors surrounding him, and the representatives of the Italian republics, was heard. The singers and players were all of them amateurs of Lyon, Mademoiselle Long, Monsieur Gerbet, post office director, and Monsieur Theodore, a merchant, each of whom had sung his part in a ravishing manner, received the felicitations of the first consul and the most gracious thanks of Madame Bonaparte. When I noticed most in the couplets which were sung on this occasion, and which resembled all occasional verses, was that the first consul was extolled in the same terms that all the poets of the empire have since employed. All the exaggerations of flattery were exhausted in the time of the consulate. In the years that followed, it was necessary to repeat them. Thus, in the Lyon couplets, the first consul was the god of victory, the conqueror of the Nile and of Neptune, the savior of the country, the peacemaker of the world, the arbiter of Europe. French soldiers were transformed into friends and companions of Alcides, etc. This was to cut the grass from under the feet of future poets. The Lyon fete terminated by a ball which lasted until daybreak. The first consul remained 2 hours, during which time he conversed with the city magistrates, while the more considerable inhabitants were offering to their guests this magnificent entertainment. The people, in spite of the cold, were devoting themselves to dancing and pleasure in the public squares. Toward midnight, some very fine fireworks were set off on the Place Bonaparte. After spending 15 or 18 days at Lyon, we resumed the road to Paris. The first consul and his wife still continued to reside by preference at Malmaison. It was, I think, shortly after the return of the first consul that a man, not at all well dressed, solicited an audience. He was ushered into the cabinet and asked what he wanted. "General," responded the solicitor, intimidated by his presence, "it was I who had the honor to give you writing lessons at the school of Brienne." "The fine pupil that you made there," quickly interrupted the first consul. "I compliment you on it." Then he was the first to laugh at his vivacity and addressed some good-natured remarks to this honest man, whose timidity had not been lessened by such a compliment. A few days later, the master received from the worst, doubtless, of all his pupils at Brienne — everyone knows how badly the emperor wrote — a pension sufficient for his needs. Another of the former teachers of the first consul, Monsieur l'Abbé Dupuis, had been placed by him at Malmaison in the capacity of private librarian. He lived and died there. He was a modest man and had the reputation of being well informed. The first consul often visited him in his apartment and always showed him every imaginable regard and attention. Chapter 9. The day of the proclamation made by the first consul of the law on public worship, he arose early and summoned his attendants to make his toilette. While they were dressing him, I saw Monsieur Joseph Bonaparte and Consul Cambaceres enter his apartment. "Well," said the first consul to the latter, "we are going to mass. What do they think of that in Paris?" "Many people," responded Mr. Cambaceres, "propose going to the first representation and hissing the piece if they do not find it amusing." What did I do? Okay, that was right. "If anyone takes a notion to hiss, I will have him turned out of doors by the grenadiers of the consular guard." "But what if the grenadiers begin to hiss like the others?" "As to that, I have no fears. My old moustaches will go to Notre Dame here just as they went to the mosque in Cairo. They will look to see what I am doing, and seeing me behave seriously and decently, they will do the same, saying to themselves, 'That's the regulation.' I am afraid," said Monsieur Joseph Bonaparte, "that the general officers may not be so accommodating. I have just left Augereau, who is spitting fire and flame at what he calls your pious affectations. He and several others will not be easy to bring into the bosom of our Holy Mother, the Church." "Bah! Is Augereau like that? He's a brawler who makes a good deal of racket, and if he has some imbecile little cousin, he will put him in the seminary for me to make a chaplain of him. Apropos," pursued the first consul, addressing his colleagues, "when is your brother going to take possession of his see in Rouen? Do you know he has the finest archbishopric in France there? He will be a cardinal before the year is over. That is a settled affair." The second consul bowed. From that moment, his behavior towards the first consul was rather that of a courtier than an equal. The plenipotentiaries who had been appointed to discuss and sign the Concordat were Messieurs Joseph Bonaparte, Courtet, and the Abbé Bernier. The latter, whom I have sometimes seen at the Tuileries, had been a chief of Chouette, and everything about him showed it. In the same conversation of which I have just related the commencement, the first consul spoke with his two interlocutors about the conferences on the Concordat. The Abbé Bernier, he said, frightened the Italian prelates by the vehemence of his logic. One would have thought he believed himself still conducting the Vendéans to the charge against the Blues. Nothing was more singular than the contrast of his rude and disputatious manners with the polished formalities and honeyed tone of the prelates. Cardinal Caperat came 2 days ago with a frightened air to ask whether it was true that during the War of La Vendée, the Abbé Bernier made an altar out of Republican corpses to celebrate the Mass on. I told him that I knew nothing about it, but that it was possible. General First Consul, cried the terrified cardinal, it is not a red hat, but a red cap that this man needs. I am very much afraid, went on the first consul, that may stand in the way of the Abbé Bernier's beretta. These gentlemen quitted the first consul when his toilette was finished and went to prepare themselves for the ceremony. On that day, the first consul wore the consular costume, which was a scarlet coat without lapels with a large embroidery of golden palms on the seams. The saber he had brought from Egypt was suspended at his side by a shoulder belt that was rather narrow but finely wrought and richly embroidered. He retained his black collar, being unwilling to wear a lace cravat. Otherwise, he was like his colleagues in knee breeches and slippers. A French hat with waving plumes in the 3 colors completed this rich apparel. This first celebration of the divine office at Notre Dame was a singular spectacle for the Parisians. Many people hastened thither as they would to a theatrical representation. Many also, especially among the military men, made it a subject of raillery rather than of edification. And as to those who, during the Revolution, had done all in their power to overthrow the cult which the first consul had just reestablished, they found it hard to hide their indignation and chagrin. The populace saw nothing in the Te Deum, which was chanted that day for peace and concord, but a new aliment offered to their curiosity. But in the middle class, a great number of pious persons who had keenly regretted the suppression of the devotional practices in which they had been brought up were glad of the return of the ancient worship. Moreover, there was not at this time any symptom of superstition or rigorism capable of alarming the enemies of intolerance. The clergy were very careful not to show themselves too exacting. They asked very little, condemned nobody, and the representative of the Holy Father, the Cardinal Legate, pleased everybody except perhaps some old priests vexed by his indulgence, the worldly grace of his manners, and the freedom of his conduct. This prelate was in perfect accord with the first consul, who liked his conversation very much. It is certain also that all religious sentiment, apart the fidelity of the people to their ancient customs, made them return with pleasure to the repose and celebration of Sunday. The Republican calendar was no doubt learnedly calculated, but it had been smitten with ridicule in the first place by the replacement of the saints of the ancient calendar by the days of the ass, the pig, the turnip, the onion, etc. Besides, if it was skillfully calculated, it was not at all commodiously divided. And on this head, I recall the witticism of a very clever man, and one who, in spite of the disapprobation contained in his words, would yet have desired the establishment of the republican system elsewhere except in the almanac. When the decree of the convention ordaining the adoption of the republican calendar was published, he said, "They may say what they like, but they will have to do with 2 enemies who will not yield, the beard and the white skirt. The fact is that for the working class, and for all the classes employed in difficult tasks, there was too long an interval between one decady to another. I do not know whether This was the effect of a deeply rooted routine, but the populace, accustomed to work for 6 consecutive days and to rest on the 7th, found 9 days of uninterrupted labor very long. Hence, the suppression of the decades was universally approved. The decree which appointed Sunday as the day for the publications of the bans of marriage was not so much so, some persons dreading that the former pretensions of the clergy over the civil state might revive.